A man walks through Warsaw Central Station, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing an expensive overcoat against the Polish winter. Confident, unremarkable, speaking fluent Polish with a slight accent that could be Turkish or Lebanese. He checks the departures board, buys a coffee from a kiosk, and heads toward Platform 7, where the express to Berlin departs in 20 minutes. Just another businessman traveling through Europe's rail network on a Tuesday afternoon in February. What he doesn't see is the woman reading a magazine 3 meters behind him, who's been following him since he left his hotel. The maintenance worker cleaning windows who photographs his ticket purchase. The train conductor who receives an encrypted message seconds after he boards identifying his exact carriage and seat number. This man's name is Khalid Mashal al-Hadi, and he's not a businessman despite the cover his passport provides. He's a financial architect who's moved over 200 million euros through European banks in the past 3 years, funding weapons purchases, operational cells, and the infrastructure of violence across the Middle East. And tonight, somewhere between Warsaw and Berlin, his journey will end in a way that will never appear in any official report. This was interdiction perfected, silent, executed on a moving train while European security services remained completely unaware that an operation was unfolding through their territory. The ticket inspector moved through carriage 4 with practiced efficiency. What he observed and what he transmitted through the device disguised as a phone would trigger the final authorization from Tel Aviv. The intelligence machinery of elimination had been tracking Khalid for 18 months, mapping his movements across Europe, identifying his patterns, and waiting for the perfect opportunity when he would be vulnerable, isolated, and accessible. That moment had arrived on this train departing Warsaw for Berlin. A 6-hour journey through Polish and German countryside, where a man could die quietly and no one would know until the train pulled into Berlin Hauptbahnhof with one passenger who would never disembark. This is the story of how intelligence services transform public transportation into theaters of execution. How first-class rail travel becomes the architecture of assassination, and how a man can be killed surrounded by other passengers while everyone remains oblivious to the violence occurring 3 meters away. It reveals something darker than operational success, the existence of a global system where certain people can be eliminated anywhere, at any time, by states that have decided their existence represents an unacceptable threat regardless of international law, sovereignty, or the safety of innocent civilians who might be nearby. Understanding why Khalid Mashal al-Hadi was targeted requires understanding who he was and how he built one of Hamas's most sophisticated financial networks in Europe. Born in 1972 in Kuwait City to a Palestinian family that had fled during the Nakba, Khalid grew up in exile with stories of a homeland he'd never seen. His father worked as an accountant for a Kuwaiti trading company. His mother taught Arabic literature at a private school. From childhood, Khalid absorbed the narratives of displacement, Israeli aggression, and Palestinian resistance that defined his family's identity. Every dinner conversation reinforced the same themes. Return was not just a dream, but a duty. Resistance was not terrorism, but liberation. And supporting those who fought was as important as fighting yourself. Khalid excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and economics. He studied at Kuwait University, earning degrees in finance and international business. His professors described him as brilliant with numbers, able to see patterns in financial data that others missed. He could look at balance sheets and identify irregularities instantly. He understood currency exchange mechanisms, offshore banking structures, and the maze of regulations governing international financial transfers. These skills made him valuable to legitimate businesses, but they would make him invaluable to organizations that needed to move money invisibly. His recruitment by Hamas came in 1995 when he was 23. A family friend who knew his skills and his political sympathies made the introduction. Hamas was expanding its operations beyond military resistance into building a comprehensive organizational infrastructure that included social services, political activism, and critically, financial networks that could sustain operations over decades. They needed people who understood modern finance, who could navigate European banking systems, and who had the ideological commitment to dedicate their lives to the cause. Khalid fit perfectly. His initial assignment was studying how other organizations, both legitimate and illicit, moved money internationally. He analyzed charities that funded development projects in Palestine, understanding how they structured transactions to pass regulatory scrutiny. He studied money laundering techniques used by drug cartels and organized crime, learning how criminal networks disguised the origins of funds. He examined terrorist financing methods used by other groups, understanding what worked and what led to detection and prosecution. Over 2 years of research, Khalid became an expert in the dark art of moving money invisibly. In 1997, Hamas sent him to Europe with a simple mission: build financial networks that could move tens of millions of dollars annually to support operations while remaining completely invisible to European and American authorities. He established himself in Amsterdam first, a city whose liberal banking regulations and massive commercial shipping industry provided perfect cover. He registered several import-export companies that conducted minimal legitimate business but processed millions in transactions through their accounts. Money from donors in the Gulf would arrive as payment for goods that were never actually shipped. That money would then be transferred to other accounts, converted to different currencies, moved through multiple jurisdictions, and eventually arrive in Gaza or Lebanon as cash delivered by couriers who crossed borders with amounts small enough to avoid reporting requirements. The system Khalid built was sophisticated beyond what most terrorist organizations achieved. He understood that the key to avoiding detection was making everything appear legitimate. His companies filed proper tax returns. They maintained professional websites and marketing materials. They had phone numbers answered by people who could discuss business convincingly. To any investigator doing routine checks, these looked like real businesses operating legally. The fact that 90% of their financial transactions were actually moving terrorist financing was hidden beneath layers of complexity that would require months of forensic accounting to unravel. Between 1997 and 2005, Khalid expanded the network dramatically. He established operations in Amsterdam, Brussels, Vienna, and Berlin. He recruited a team of Palestinian and sympathetic European nationals who managed the day-to-day operations while he oversaw the strategic architecture. He developed relationships with corrupt bankers who asked no questions about unusual transactions in exchange for substantial fees. He identified money service businesses and currency exchanges that had weak compliance procedures and could be exploited to move cash across borders without triggering regulatory alerts. The network's operations fell into several categories. First, donor cultivation. Khalid identified wealthy individuals in Gulf states who supported Palestinian resistance and convinced them to contribute funds that would be moved through his European networks. He assured them their donations would support humanitarian activities, which was technically true since Hamas used fungible money to fund both military operations and social services. Second, commercial front operations. His companies engaged in legitimate trade, importing goods from Turkey and exporting to North Africa, but the profits from this trade were minuscule compared to the terrorist financing hidden within the transaction flows. Third, cash courier networks. When electronic transfers became too risky, Khalid organized teams of couriers who physically carried cash across borders, utilizing the Schengen zone's open borders to move money from Western Europe to Eastern Europe and eventually to the Middle East. European intelligence services detected pieces of Khalid's network periodically. Dutch authorities investigated one of his Amsterdam companies in 2003, but found insufficient evidence for prosecution. Belgian police arrested one of his couriers in 2004, carrying 40,000 euros in cash, but couldn't prove terrorist financing, charging him only with currency reporting violations. German financial regulators flagged suspicious transactions from a Berlin account in 2005, but lost track of the money trail through Cyprus and Turkey. Each of these investigative failures demonstrated the sophistication of Khalid's systems. He compartmented operations so that compromising one element didn't expose others. He used cutouts and intermediaries so that transactions couldn't be traced directly to him. And he constantly evolved his methods, closing operations that attracted attention and opening new ones in different jurisdictions. What finally brought intensive focus on Khalid was not European counterterrorism but Israeli intelligence. Mossad had been tracking Hamas financing globally as part of broader efforts to degrade the organization's capabilities. In 2006, signals intelligence intercepted communications between Hamas leadership in Damascus and an operative in Europe discussing the engineer who had successfully moved money for a weapons purchase. The context suggested this engineer was managing significant financial operations. Analysts began searching for individuals matching that profile. Khalid's name emerged through painstaking analysis of travel records, corporate registrations, and financial transaction patterns. By 2007, Mossad had identified him as a priority target. The initial Israeli assessment was that Khalid should be captured rather than killed. He possessed knowledge about Hamas's entire financial infrastructure in Europe. Interrogation could reveal donor networks, banking relationships, courier routes, and the identities of dozens of operatives. A capture operation was planned for 2008 when intelligence indicated Khalid would be in Prague. But the operation was aborted when Czech security services increased presence in the area where the capture was planned, apparently responding to unrelated criminal activity but creating too much risk of exposure. After that failed opportunity, Khalid became more cautious, varying his travel patterns and spending less time in any single location. For 5 years, from 2008 to 2013, Mossad maintained surveillance on Khalid without finding another opportunity for capture. He traveled frequently but unpredictably. He stayed in different hotels, used various transportation methods, and met contacts in public places where grabbing him would be impossible without causing a scene that would expose the operation. During this period, his network continued growing. Israeli intelligence estimated that between 2010 and 2013, Khalid's networks moved over 150 million euros that financed Hamas operations, including weapons purchases, operational cells in Europe, and the reconstruction of military infrastructure in Gaza after Israeli operations damaged it. The decision to shift from capture to elimination came in 2013, after the network was linked to financing a planned attack in Bulgaria. Israeli intelligence intercepted communications suggesting money moved through. Khalid's networks had funded reconnaissance for an operation targeting Israeli tourists. The attack was disrupted before execution, but the connection convinced Israeli leadership that Khalid represented an active threat that couldn't wait for the perfect capture opportunity that might never come. Authorization for elimination was granted, placing Khalid on the standing target list that gave field operatives permission to act when opportunities arose. Tracking Khalid's movements required enormous resources. Israeli intelligence coordinated with liaison services in multiple European countries, though without revealing the full scope of their interest in him. They positioned surveillance teams in cities where he operated regularly. They hacked into his communications, reading his emails and intercepting his phone calls despite the encryption he used. They tracked his financial transactions, identifying patterns in when and where he moved money that corresponded with his travel. Slowly, a picture emerged of his routines and vulnerabilities. The Warsaw opportunity developed in January 2014. Signals intelligence detected Khalid arranging meetings in Warsaw with contacts from Turkey and Lebanon. The meetings suggested a major financial transaction was being coordinated, likely involving weapons financing. Israeli intelligence confirmed through surveillance that Khalid would be in Warsaw for 3 days in mid-February. His pattern when visiting Warsaw was consistent. He stayed at the Intercontinental Hotel, met contacts at cafes in the city center, and always departed by train rather than flying, apparently believing rail travel offered better security than airports where passport controls and security screening created documentation and exposure. The train from Warsaw to Berlin became the kill zone. The route offered several advantages from an operational perspective. The journey took 6 hours, providing an extended window for action. The train crossed through sparsely populated areas where cellular coverage was intermittent, delaying any emergency response if something went wrong. And, critically, the victim would be in a confined space where he couldn't flee and where the assassination could be staged to appear like natural causes, buying time before authorities recognized what had occurred. The operation required positioning assets along Khalid's entire journey. Surveillance teams tracked him from his hotel to the train station. An operative posing as a passenger ensured he boarded the correct train. Another operative, playing the role of a conductor, confirmed his seat assignment. And in the carriage where Khalid would spend 6 hours believing he was safe, 2 Mossad operatives waited in seats carefully selected during the reservation process weeks earlier. They would execute the mission using a method that would leave investigators concluding Khalid had died from sudden cardiac arrest, a plausible explanation for a man in his early 40s who traveled constantly, ate poorly, and lived under the stress of managing illegal operations while evading law enforcement. On February 18, 2014, Khalid checked out of the Intercontinental Hotel at 1300 hours. Surveillance teams confirmed he was alone. His security apparently minimal given his assessment that Warsaw was a low-threat environment. He took a taxi to Warsaw Central Station, arriving at 1400 hours for a train departing at 1500. He purchased a coffee and a sandwich, browsed a bookstore, and boarded the train at 1445, taking his assigned seat in first-class carriage 4. 2 rows behind him sat a woman reading a German magazine. 3 rows ahead sat a man working on a laptop. Both were Mossad operatives who had boarded 30 minutes earlier to establish their presence as normal passengers before Khalid arrived. The train departed precisely on schedule. For the first hour, nothing unusual occurred. Passengers settled into their seats, reading books, working on computers, or sleeping. Khalid spent the time reviewing documents from his briefcase, occasionally making notes with a pen. He appeared relaxed, unaware that the passengers around him included 2 operatives whose sole purpose was ending his life. At 1600 hours, the woman who had been reading a magazine stood and walked toward the bathroom, passing Khalid's seat. As she passed, she stumbled slightly, her hand brushing his shoulder in what appeared to be an accidental touch to steady herself. She apologized in German and continued to the bathroom. That touch, lasting less than 2 seconds, delivered the poison. A transdermal chemical compound absorbed through skin contact. The substance was designed to mimic natural cardiac arrest. It would take approximately 90 minutes to produce symptoms, giving the operative time to be far from Khalid when he began experiencing distress. The compound was sophisticated, developed specifically for intelligence operations where autopsies might be performed. Even forensic toxicology would struggle to identify it, and the symptoms would so closely match natural heart failure that medical examiners would require specific reason to suspect poisoning before conducting the specialized tests that might detect it. Khalid felt nothing from the contact. He continued reading his documents, unaware that molecules were already entering his bloodstream and beginning their lethal work. The female operative returned from the bathroom and resumed her seat, maintaining her cover as a normal passenger. The male operative ahead of Khalid occasionally glanced back, monitoring for any indication that something was wrong prematurely. The operation was progressing exactly as planned. At 1700 hours, Khalid began showing the first signs of distress. He loosened his tie and unbuttoned his collar. He wiped sweat from his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the carriage. Other passengers noticed nothing unusual. A man feeling warm and loosening his clothing was completely unremarkable. By 1715, Khalid's discomfort was increasing. He pressed his hand against his chest, a gesture suggesting pain or pressure. His breathing became slightly labored. The passenger sitting across the aisle, an actual German businessman with no connection to the operation, asked in German if he was all right. Khalid nodded, saying he just needed some air, and stood to walk toward the space between carriages where he could open a window. This movement toward isolation was exactly what the operatives anticipated. The poison's psychological effects included anxiety and a desire to be away from others. Khalid made his way unsteadily to the vestibule between carriages 4 and 5. The male operative followed at a discreet distance, ostensibly going to stretch his legs. When he reached the vestibule, he found Khalid leaning against the wall, breathing heavily, his face pale and covered in sweat. The operative, speaking in English with concern, asked if he needed help, if they should alert the conductor to stop the train for medical assistance. Khalid shook his head, insisting he was fine, just needed a moment. The operative stayed nearby, playing the concerned fellow passenger, while Khalid's condition deteriorated rapidly. At 1735, Khalid collapsed. The operative caught him, lowering him to the floor of the vestibule, and immediately called for help. Other passengers rushed to the scene. Someone pulled the emergency communication cord to alert the conductor. The female operative, maintaining her cover, arrived with the crowd and knelt beside Khaled, claiming she was a nurse and checking his vital signs. She announced he had no pulse and began performing CPR while others watched, some filming with their phones. The conductor arrived within 2 minutes and radioed ahead for emergency services to meet the train at the next station, 40 minutes away in the Polish town of Konin. The female operative continued CPR with professional competence that reinforced her nurse cover story. But she knew he was already dead. The poison had completed its work. By the time the train pulled into Konin station at 1815, Khalid Mishal al-Hadi had been dead for approximately 30 minutes. Polish emergency medical services confirmed death at 1820. The body was removed from the train for transport to a local hospital where an autopsy would be performed. The train, delayed by 50 minutes, continued to Berlin carrying passengers who had witnessed what appeared to be a tragic but entirely natural death of a fellow traveler. The two Mossad operatives remained on the train, maintaining their covers. They had touched nothing except Khalid during the CPR attempt, which was expected and left no suspicious evidence. When German police later reviewed the incident as part of standard procedures for foreign nationals dying on international trains, they found nothing unusual. A passenger had suffered apparent cardiac arrest. Fellow passengers had attempted to help. Emergency services had responded. The death was unfortunate but unremarkable. The autopsy performed in Konin concluded that Khalid died from acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack. The pathologist noted that the deceased had no significant prior medical history available, but that sudden cardiac death in apparently healthy adults, while rare, was not unheard of. The toxicology screening performed was routine, checking for common drugs and alcohol. It found nothing because the compound used was not something routine screening would detect. A more comprehensive toxicological analysis might have identified unusual substances, but there was no reason to perform such testing. The death appeared natural. Polish authorities contacted the German embassy since Khalid's passport identified him as a German citizen, part of his cover identity. The Germans contacted his listed next of kin, a phone number that reached an answering service. No one claimed the body. After 30 days in a Polish morgue, Khalid Mishal al-Hadi was buried in an unmarked grave in Konin. A foreign national who died far from home with no family to retrieve him. His real identity was never discovered by Polish or German authorities. As far as official records showed, a German businessman named Marcus Hoffmann had died of natural causes while traveling through Poland. Hamas learned of Khalid's death through their own networks when he failed to make scheduled contacts. By the time they confirmed what happened, investigating through European contacts and eventually identifying his body through photographs taken at the hospital, it was too late to do anything. They couldn't publicly acknowledge his death without revealing his true identity and operations. They couldn't demand investigation without exposing their networks. They could only absorb the loss silently and attempt to rebuild the financial infrastructure he had managed. For Israeli intelligence, the operation was considered a complete success. A high-value target had been eliminated without exposure, without diplomatic incident, and without alerting Hamas to the full extent of Israeli knowledge about their financial networks. The method of elimination appeared completely natural, preventing Hamas from learning operational details that might help them protect other personnel. And critically, Khalid's death disrupted financial flows at a crucial moment, delaying weapons purchases and forcing Hamas to scramble to maintain operations while finding someone to replace him. The investigation into Khalid's networks intensified after his death. With their primary target eliminated, Israeli intelligence shared more information with European counterparts, leading to coordinated law enforcement actions that dismantled much of the infrastructure he'd built. Between 2014 and 2016, authorities in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and Austria arrested 17 individuals connected to the networks, froze over 50 million euros in accounts linked to terrorist financing, and shut down dozens of front companies. The entire system Khalid had spent nearly 2 decades building was destroyed within 18 months of his death. Hamas eventually reconstituted its European financing, but never to the same level of sophistication. Khalid's replacement, a younger operative without the same experience and expertise, was arrested in Turkey in 2017 attempting to move money through channels that had already been compromised. The arrest provided further intelligence that led to additional dismantling of Hamas financial infrastructure. The cumulative effect of Khalid's elimination and the subsequent operations significantly degraded Hamas's ability to finance operations in Europe. The passengers who witnessed Khalid's death moved on with their lives, probably remembering the incident occasionally, but having no reason to suspect it was anything other than what it appeared to be. The woman who claimed to be a nurse and performed CPR likely impressed fellow passengers with her professionalism and compassion in trying to save a stranger. No one suspected she had killed him. The man who helped lower the body and called for assistance was thanked by other passengers for his quick thinking. No one knew he was part of the execution team. The entire operation had unfolded in front of witnesses who saw exactly what the operatives wanted them to see and nothing more. The broader implications of the Warsaw operation extend beyond the elimination of one Hamas financial operative. It demonstrated that even sophisticated terrorist organizations with experienced operatives are vulnerable to patient, well-resourced intelligence services. Khalid had been careful, varying his patterns, using encryption, maintaining cover identities, but ultimately, none of those precautions protected him when Israeli intelligence decided he was worth the resources required to track and eliminate him. The operation also revealed the extent to which public spaces offer no safety to individuals targeted by state intelligence service. A train full of passengers couldn't prevent Khalid's murder because no one recognized it as murder until long after the operatives responsible had vanished into normal life. The ethics of the operation remained debated within intelligence communities. Conducting an assassination on a train full of civilians carried risks. If something had gone wrong, if the poison had been delivered incorrectly and Khalid had realized he was being killed, if he had been armed and responded violently, innocent passengers could have been endangered. The decision to proceed anyway reflected a calculation that the strategic value of eliminating Khalid outweighed the risks to bystanders, who were never informed they were sharing space with an intelligence operation. From Israel's perspective, the operation was justified by security imperatives and legal authorities that permit targeted killings of individuals engaged in terrorist activities against the state. Khalid was facilitating violence through his financial networks. Eliminating him prevented future attacks and degraded Hamas's operational capabilities. The fact that the elimination occurred on Polish territory without Polish knowledge or consent was unfortunate, but necessary given that Khalid could only be reached where he traveled, which was inevitably foreign territory. The method chosen minimized risks compared to alternatives, like a shooting or abduction that would have created greater danger to civilians and higher probability of exposure. Critics argue that conducting assassinations in third countries without coordination violates international law and sovereignty. Poland had no opportunity to arrest Khalid through legal processes because Israeli intelligence never informed Polish authorities of his presence or activities. The operation denied Poland the chance to exercise its own legal jurisdiction over crimes potentially committed on its territory. Moreover, using a poison that causes death resembling natural causes prevents accountability and public debate about whether such killings should occur. The woman who delivered the poison and the man who assisted in the cover story likely received commendations within Mossad for professional execution of a difficult operation. Their ability to maintain cover while performing an assassination in a public space full of witnesses demonstrated the highest level of tradecraft. They followed their training, maintained discipline under pressure, and completed the mission without exposure. In intelligence services, such operations become career-defining successes that lead to advancement and assignment to increasingly important missions. For Hamas, Khalid's death was catastrophic but not unprecedented. The organization had lost key personnel to Israeli operations before and would lose more in the future. The cycle of resistance, elimination, and replacement continued as it had for decades. New financial operatives were recruited and trained. New networks were built, learning from the mistakes that led to Khalid's exposure and death. The conflict between Israeli intelligence and Hamas operations would continue regardless of individual casualties on either side. The poison used to kill Khalid represents years of research by specialists in toxicology and chemistry working in classified facilities. Developing compounds that can kill reliably while mimicking natural causes requires testing and refinement that raises profound ethical questions. Subjects for such testing cannot be human for obvious moral and legal reasons. Yet the compounds must ultimately be used on humans, creating unavoidable uncertainty about effects. The technical expertise required to synthesize, store, and deploy such substances safely for operatives while remaining lethal to targets demonstrates the sophistication of modern intelligence operations. The operation's success depended on dozens of people beyond the two operatives on the train. Surveillance teams tracked Khalid for months. Technical specialists hacked his communications and monitored his financial transactions. Analysts processed the intelligence and identified patterns. Planners designed the operation and coordinated logistics. Support personnel manufactured the poison and prepared the delivery mechanism. Legal advisors reviewed authorities and provided advice on compliance with Israeli law governing targeted killings. All of these people contributed to the operation's success, while most never came close to the actual execution. The train from Warsaw to Berlin continues running daily, carrying thousands of passengers annually who have no idea that in Carriage 4 in February 2014, a man was murdered by intelligence operatives while fellow passengers watched unknowingly. The vestibule where Khalid collapsed has been cleaned thousands of times since that evening. The seat where he sat has been occupied by countless other travelers. Nothing marks the location of his death because that's the nature of perfect operations. They leave no trace, no memorial, no acknowledgement that anything extraordinary occurred. What Khalid Mashal al-Hadi's death reveals about modern intelligence operations is that the battlefield extends everywhere. Cities, trains, hotels, restaurants, any place becomes a potential kill zone when intelligence services decide someone must die. The sophistication of methods means even witnesses present at the scene see nothing suspicious. And the global reach of intelligence services means no location offers safety to those who've been designated targets. Khalid probably believed traveling by train through Poland was safer than flying, that avoiding major capitals reduced his exposure, that varying his patterns provided security. None of it mattered when faced with an adversary with unlimited patience and resources who could track him across continents and wait years for the perfect opportunity to kill him in a way that would appear completely natural. The Hamas Financier who replaced Khalid in managing Hamas's European networks was arrested in 2017. He survived, facing trial in Germany for terrorist financing, but his networks were dismantled before they could achieve a fraction of what Khalid had built. Hamas's financial capabilities in Europe never recovered to previous levels. Whether Khalid's elimination permanently degraded those capabilities or merely delayed their reconstruction remains debated. Intelligence officers argue the operation achieved its objectives by disrupting finances and demonstrating reach. Skeptics note Hamas continues operating despite losses like Khalid, suggesting targeted killings provide temporary tactical victories without strategic resolution. The story ends not with any dramatic resolution, but with silence and the mundane continuation of normal life. Trains still run from Warsaw to Berlin. Passengers still sit in first class reading magazines and working on laptops. And somewhere, intelligence services still track individuals they've designated as threats, waiting patiently for the opportunity to eliminate them in ways that will appear unremarkable to everyone except the target, who realizes in their final moments that the stranger who stumbled and touched their shoulder wasn't clumsy but lethal. That understanding comes too late to matter, which is precisely how perfect operations are designed to conclude. O quodpod commodor eros, confira sempre as respostas.